So first of all, let me start. What's the general objective of tax cooperation and international tax cooperation? I think at a very broad level, our general objective is global fiscal justice, which you can define in a very simple way, which is, we want some level of tax progressivity on high income, wealth, large corporations, or at least we want to avoid regressivity. So we want to avoid that high income, high wealth individual pay less than the middle class or lower income, lower wealth group. We want to avoid that large corporations pay less than small or medium-sized enterprise. The problem, as you all know, is that in fact in many poor and emerging countries, and also in many rich countries, this is not the case. This is not always the case. So even this minimum condition of sort of non-regressivity is not satisfied. And so one of the objectives of international tax cooperation is to have this minimum level of tax progressivity, and then we can disagree on how progressive this should be, but that's, avoiding regressivity is the sort of minimum common goal. To do what? Well, generally speaking, to finance inclusive and sustainable development, which includes investment, education, health, climate, energy, infrastructure. Okay, at this level, I think almost everybody should agree on the objective. Then let's see, what are the next steps if we want to go in this direction. Well, I think the second statement, I want to make now is that global fiscal justice requires tax coordination at a global level, so typically at the level at the United Nations or some other, global forum, rather than a rich club, which is the OECD. And I think here things can become more controversial because some people are very attached to OECD as the right place to talk about international tax cooperation. But I believe, and I think collectively at ICRICT believe, but many other organizations outside ICRICT believe that it is time to move to another level of negotiation. And so, as you know, there is an ongoing project for UN tax convention. Why is this so important? Well, simply because as long as this is done at the level of OECD, which is a rich country club, you can see how, poor countries and the global south will be left outside of the discussion. The objective of rich OECD countries is basically to split between themselves, whatever extra fiscal resources can be obtained through cooperation, with, in practice, very little left for poor countries. And the problem is that in my view, and I think in our view at ICRICT, and again this includes many of the organizations involved in this process, a substantial part of the new tax revenue, in particular on global reach or multinationals, should at the end be redistributed to the global south in proportion to population and climate exposure. And I think that's a very important point, is that many rich countries, including in Europe or France, participating to this discussion, they want to be able to tax their own multinationals, their own billionaires. Well, sometimes they don't even want to do that, but when they are officially supporting this, their objective is to be able to raise their own tax revenue on their own multinationals and billionaires. But in fact, a substantial part of this tax revenue will have to be shared with the rest of the world, in particular to pay for climate reparation, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, which are going to be enormous needs in the future. And as you know, rich countries have an obvious historical responsibility for climate warming, and they keep making a promise to the global south about climate reparation, which never come. And I think as long as we don't have a fiscal resource which you can use to make some of this payment, the situation will remain like this, where rich countries promise transfer to the climate, which are never really supported. So this, to me, this is really part of why we want the discussion to happen at the UN global level, so that at least there is a chance that we take this global interest into account. Now, the third point is that, we cannot wait for unanimity. So we need coalitions of willing countries to take unilateral action. I mean, in some case, the coalition can be only one country. I think there's a lot that can be done at a one country level. So, in the case of France, I think France could have a minimum wealth tax of 2% on wealth above 100 million euro and could do a lot more. Now, if you have coalitions of countries, you can do even more, but you should not wait to unanimity. And of course, we need to get accustomed to the fact that we need to have coalition without the US. That's quite obvious with the current Trump administration. And I see Joe, who I know, agree about this. But, I think, in a way, this was already the case before. Biden did not support the global tax on billionaires, actually opposed it quite strongly. And, future US tax administration might not be more cooperative. So we have to think of, coalitions that can work without the US. The good news is that, the weight of the US in terms of share of the US in global GDP is going to keep falling. So, it was 40% after World War II. It is less than 20% today, and it will be less than 10% by 2050, 2060. So by definition, this is going to become a shrinking share of global GDP. So there are coalitions that can be made without the US, and we need to start seriously thinking about that. The fourth point I want to make, which is even more controversial in a way, is that non-participating countries at some point will have to suffer penalties, trade sanctions, financial sanctions by not participating to cooperation. So typically, the US at some point will need to be penalized for exceptionally high per capita emission or non-cooperative attitude on taxation of multinationals or billionaires. Now, that's going to be, I'm not saying this is going to be simple, this is going to be very complicated, but there's really no other way. In the long run, it's very difficult to imagine any transition toward global justice, and in particular global tax justice, if we don't think ahead of time or what kind of coalitions of countries can impose which trade regime or financial regime to countries that are non-cooperative and which in some cases are very aggressively non-cooperative with the goals for climate, for tax justice that are being pursued. So this is complicated, but again, the share of the US in world GDP is going to go down and down, and so in a way, this will become simpler and simpler. This doesn't mean this is going to be simple, but I think we have to go in this direction. Now, before I leave the floor to the panel, which I am sure will have a lot more to say about these issues, let me simply say that on all these issues, we are working at the World Inequality Lab to in the context of what we call the Global Justice Project, to produce a plan for equality, prosperity within planetary boundaries by the end of the century. This will be presented right in this amphitheater next June, and you are all most welcome to come to the World Inequality Conference that will take place. There is a description on the World Inequality Lab website of this project. Just one thing I want to mention is that in this project, and I think more generally, when we talk about global tax reform and global tax coordination, we need to think not only about the transformation of the international tax system, but more generally, so there's a description online, we also are making proposal on the transformation of the international monetary and trade system. And I think the two, the international tax system and the international monetary and trade system have to be thought through together. Let me just show you one simple graph, which is the evolution after the crisis of 2008 and 2020 of the emission of SDR, which are the special drawing rights issued by IMF, which is a sort of quasi-international currency. This is not as ambitious as the international currencies that Keynes wanted to create in 1944-45, but this is what we have so far. Now, there was, after the 2008-2020 crisis, a significant rise of SDR issues. Now it's still small, it's less than 1% of GDP, world GDP, but this is still a lot of money. This is getting close to 1% of world GDP. This could be, Keynes wanted 5% of world GDP. It could be more than that. What about, future money creation in order to finance, climate mitigation? I think these are issues. Joe has been thinking a lot about that for a long time, has been pushing that for a long time, and we are very much, following, this line of thought. Now, of course, you need to find a balance between fiscal resources and monetary resources. If you do everything in money creation, you are clearly going to have difficulties. So I'm certainly not saying that, but we really need to look at the two together. And to conclude with, one reason for optimism is that, status quo. So all of this, everything I have said can seem completely, utopian, idealistic, very difficult. In some way it is, but let me simply say one thing. Status quo is just not an option, in the sense that the system, the economic system today and the international economic order today, is not frozen. It will have to change. Just to give you one example, if you just apply the statutes of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in fact, the US are about to lose their veto power, in particular on important decisions like issuance of SDR. So, every time you had new issue of SDR, it was under Democratic administration. Republican administration would never accept to issue international currency and distribute it to all countries. So with Trump, this is not going to happen. But, the US right now has 17% of the vote at IMF. They used to have 35-40% at the creation of IMF. But there are statutes where, it's proportional to your GDP. There's a complicated formula. PPP GDP was introduced in 2008, by the way, so it makes it a bit less unequal. They are about to go down below 15%. They will go toward 10%. And, I think the reason why we see so much nervosity with the Trump administration is that they know they are losing control of the world, basically. And so they're trying to compensate this by being very excited and talking very loudly and trying to use their military even more than in usual times. But, at the end of the day, their role will decline. So in particular, if we apply the Bretton Woods institution statute, they will lose their veto power very soon. And China is scheduled to rise to very large voting rights. Now, this is unclear whether this will be accepted by the North and South, and there are various ways to block the application of the statute. It's unclear whether shifting from USA hegemon to China hegemon is any good for global justice. But in any case, this shows that the system cannot continue in the current state. It will have to go under enormous transformation in the coming decades. And so the conclusion for me is that it is time to think sort of out of the box and to formulate ambitious alternatives based on global fiscal justice and more democratic international economic order. And I think that the kind of forum and the kind of panel discussions that we are going to have today, can contribute to this. So thanks a lot for your attention.